G'day and welcome to this week's episode of The Other Side Interviews. I'm Damian Coory and this is our weekly interview show which streams every Tuesday night on ADH TV at around 6 p.m. and then up on demand for you afterwards. We're also on most podcast platforms at The Other Side Australia. And remember to put the Australia in or you'll get all sorts of weird and wonderful things. Well, my guest tonight is a very special one, the very distinguished United States constitutional expert and former Harvard University Law School professor, Alan Dershowitz. Professor Dershowitz taught at the Ivy League school from 1964 to 2013, almost 50 years. He's represented such celebrity clients as Mike Tyson, Julian Assange, and Bill Clinton. And he advised on the O.J. Simpson trial and was a member of President Donald Trump's defense team in his first impeachment trial in 2020. One of the reasons that Alan Dershowitz is so respected is that he doesn't put politics before the rule of law. In 2019, he said he would enthusiastically support Joe Biden for president and that he's been a Democrat voter most of his life. In 2021, he said that Trump's rally before the 2021 storming of the United States Capitol was constitutionally protected speech. He said it would be his honor and privilege to defend Trump in a trial. Now, this is because he can separate his personal politics from what is the rule of law. And that is an ability and a fundamental characteristic of great civic leaders that I fear we may be losing in modern liberal democracies today, including Australia, as our criminal justice system becomes more and more used for political attacks. Professor Dershowitz joins me from New York tonight. Sir, it is an honor to have you on the show. Tell us firstly, you've got a new book out called Get Trump. What is the premise of that book?
Well, first of all, I love Australia. I've been there on numerous occasions and I've had wonderful, wonderful times, both in the cities and on the countryside and on the coast. So thank you for having me on. Look, I'm a liberal Democrat. I voted against Donald Trump twice. I fully intend to vote against him a third time. But I put civil liberties and constitutional rights before I put partisanship. And so the premise of my book is that although the ends and the goals of people who are trying to get Trump are laudable, making sure he's not the next president, the means that are being used by many, many people on the left are ignoble, unconstitutional, unethical, and just dead wrong. They're targeting him. They're going after him using different standards of justice than are used against other people. They're taking shortcuts with the Constitution and with the law, and they're endangering the rights of all Americans, liberal, conservative, pro-Trump, anti-Trump, conservative, Republicans, everybody. And so my goal is to set the legal system straight and not to allow Donald Trump and the hatred that has been generated toward him to destroy our legal system.
There seems to be a lack of understanding that if we lose these fundamental ideas and concepts, that it doesn't matter what side of politics you're on, this could affect you.
It's not a misunderstanding. By most people, they fully understand it. They just reject it.
Right.
They think Trump is so evil and so dangerous that they're prepared to knowingly take these risks with our liberty. They know that if you establish the precedent against Trump, it will be used against Biden. It will be used against members of Congress on the Democratic side. Ultimately, it will be used against me and against other Americans. They know that intellectually, but they really do have what has been called Trump derangement syndrome. I have friends who I can talk to about every subject, but when you try to talk to them about Donald Trump, they go absolutely crazy. I mean, you probably heard the name Larry David, famous, comedian, Curb Your Enthusiasm. We were close friends. Done dinners all the time, He worked out in my basement gym. I helped his daughter get into college. But as soon as I defended Trump, he could not talk to me. I said to him one day, Larry, can we talk? No, you're disgusting. You're on their side. Americans have divided our country into two sides. You're for Trump or you're against Trump, and there's no middle ground. You can't say, well, Trump did a pretty good thing on the Abraham Accords with Israel, but he did a terrible thing with immigration policy, which is what I believe. But you can't say that. You're either 100% for Trump or 100% against Trump.
Yeah, we seem to live in a very simplistic, oversimplistic, polarized world in which there's not a lot of areas for greys or nuance in discussion or debate these days. And debate seems to be very emotionally driven, not rationally driven. It's the ability of the legal system to take a more rational approach, yes, but we're seeing a loss of that now.
We're seeing a loss of that because we're seeing judges becoming polarized. We're seeing prosecutors becoming polarized. For example, last night, I finally was allowed to speak in the local library where I've spent 53 summers. I love the library. All my books, are there, and I've given talks about my books every year. But as soon as I defended Trump, I couldn't speak in the library. And they banned me completely, and I had to threaten to sue them under the First Amendment. Finally, they allowed me last night to speak to 25 people on a limited subject of another book that I had written, as long as I didn't talk about Trump or anything related to that. And we had a completely rational discussion. People loved it. It was like a law school class. As long as you don't mention Trump, you can have a reasonable discussion. And there were emotional issues: organ donation, assisted suicide, abortion. We had a really good discussion of those issues. But if I had mentioned the name Donald Trump, people would have walked out. They would have yelled at me. They would have attacked me. I needed 2 policemen there. In case I mentioned the word Trump, there were 2 policemen there to protect me physically.
Wow. Okay. It's extraordinary to think that in a country like the United States, which the rest of the Anglosphere, we in Australia, Canada, the UK, look up to the United States as a bastion of free speech. You have stronger free speech protection laws than we do. And yet we're seeing this kind of level of really what is social censorship occurring to people as esteemed and qualified as you are. What's happening inside the universities and inside the law schools?
Well, it's much worse. It's even worse. At Stanford University, for example, the Federalist Society invited a judge to talk, and they disrupted his speech, wouldn't allow him to speak. And one professor at Wayne State University urged students to kill him. They said it wasn't enough to censor him and stop him. We have to kill him. And as George Bernard Shaw once said, assassination is the ultimate form of censorship. And we are today devaluing free speech in universities. For the first time in my lifetime, I'm 84 years old. I've been teaching, for over 60 years. The first time in my lifetime, you have professors and very bright students saying free speech is patriarchal, imperial, whatever bad words you want. They are denouncing free speech, saying free speech is part of our repressive society. What we need is only free speech for me, but not for thee. We're actually seeing that. We're seeing it in terms of due process, too. We don't need trials. We know that if a woman accuses a man of something, we know he's guilty and she's telling the truth. Why do you need a trial? Why do you need processes? Why do you need an impeachment proceeding? Everybody knows that Donald Trump committed impeachable offenses, even though it's not in the Constitution. And I was attacked for defending him against an unconstitutional impeachment, even though I would have been very happy if he had been defeated in 2016, and will be very happy if he's defeated in 2024. But people confuse politics and partisanship with the law and civil liberties, and it's very dangerous because the people who are most guilty are young people today at colleges and universities who will be our future leaders. 10 years from now, these people who are preventing judges from speaking will be members of Congress, running for president, editors of the New York Times, editors of CNN, presidents of universities or deans of law schools. And the problem is getting worse, not better. And I have a new book coming out called The New McCarthyism, which I believe is more dangerous even than the original McCarthyism of 1940s and 1950s, which I actually lived through as a student. So I am not optimistic about free speech. And please, Australia, Canada, Great Britain, don't follow us down this dark path. You have realistically today more free speech than we do. Our Constitution provides greater protections. For example, we're not allowed to ban race hatred or hate speech, whereas most of the other British countries can do that to some degree. But in reality, there is more free speech on university campuses today in other Anglo-American or Anglo-European countries and other countries than we have in the United States today. So don't borrow what's going on today in our country. We're not moving in the right direction.
It's being enforced and prosecuted in the court of public opinion through reputation destruction and social ostracization, right? Rather than in a court of law. So that's where it seems to be happening. We do have this problem in Australia. We've got a couple of very high-profile politicized cases that we've had through our criminal justice system recently. We've also got the voice to parliament changes to the Constitution, which I won't bore you with, but these changes to the Constitution will open up a whole new dimension of possibilities for the High Court of Australia to make law, which could, as you say, if we have the wrong sorts of people in the legal profession at that stage in 20 years' time, this could get quite concerning. I want to ask you specifically about Donald Trump's situation at the moment. We only get snippets in Australia, and the snippets are from the mainstream American media. So the perception in Australia is that the big orange man is bad, and we do have a fairly simplistic view, I think, mostly of Donald Trump. We don't see the other side of the story. What is your view on this current wave of prosecutions that he's facing? Is this the time that they're actually going to get Trump, finally?
Well, there are two indictments against him now. One very weak in New York. In New York, they just made it up. The DA ran for office. Remember, in America, unlike other civilized countries, you run for office as a prosecutor. It's unheard of in other countries. And you run for office as a judge. And so the people who ran for district attorney and attorney general of New York ran on the platform of Get Trump. I named my book. I didn't make up the title Get Trump. I got it from the campaign pledges of the district attorney and attorney general of New York. And so they went after him, and they didn't find any criminal conduct. And so they made it up. The New York indictment is simply made up. The idea that he didn't put on a form the fact that he paid hush money to prevent the public from learning that he had had an affair with a former porn star. I mean, it's unheard of in America that you'd have a prosecution for that. The Florida case, on the other hand, is much more serious.
Yes.
And it's serious because of what Trump said. There's this plaque that people have in their houses if they're fishermen. It's a stuffed dead fish, and it says on the bottom, "I'd still be swimming if I had kept my mouth shut." And I think that's true of Donald Trump. He would not have been indicted but for his own statements. He apparently, according to the evidence, waved a piece of paper in front of a reporter and a publisher and said, I could have declassified this when I was president, but I didn't, and it's still secret. And according to the prosecution, he showed it to these unauthorized people, and it's on tape. And that's going to be very hard to explain legally. Trump has already tried to. He said there were only newspaper clippings, that he was essentially bluffing when he suggested they were classified material. But that will be a hard defense for him to make unless he takes the witness stand at the trial. And if I were his lawyer, I would certainly recommend against him taking the witness stand, because that opens him up. And opens him up to a great deal of cross-examination about other matters and other conduct that he may have committed. So there is a substantial chance that he could be convicted of the Florida case, and the election would probably take place about the same time as the trial. And so we have this odd situation of the leading candidate running against the incumbent president being somebody who might be in the middle of trial or conceivably could be convicted. Unlikely he'll be imprisoned, but even that's a possibility. And under our Constitution, you can run for president and be elected president even if you're convicted of a felony. So that's the situation we're in.
Okay, so even if they convicted him, he could still be president of the United States.
That's right. The only grounds on which he could be denied the presidency is if he were convicted of the January 6th speech. Remember, January 6th is when the protesters went into the Capitol. I'm, in fact, representing a young student who was among the people who were protesting there. But if he's convicted of sedition, which is a stretch, but if he were to be convicted of sedition, that might disqualify him from running for president under the 14th Amendment. I don't think so, but that's the argument that's being made by some people.
We hear the word insurrection bandied about in relation to January 6th. In fact, it was pretty much the branding of the thing by the mainstream media in the United States. Does the word insurrection carry any legal connotation, or is it a fair representation, do you think, of what actually happened?
Oh, it's a completely unfair representation. Trump spoke to lots of people and he said, I want you to protest peacefully and patriotically. He didn't urge them to go into the Capitol or to do anything that was illegal. He urged them to simply protest. I think it was a terrible speech. He shouldn't have made it. People who are president of the United States shouldn't be making those kinds of challenges, and I condemn him for it. But it was not criminal. It was protected by the First Amendment, and I don't think could be a basis for any claim of insurrection. But if he were to be convicted of insurrection, it would be a possible ground for disqualification, but that would have to be done by Congress. And, you know, Congress is now split. Both houses of Congress would have to agree. And obviously, one house of Congress is today controlled by Republicans. So that's not going to happen. And so he will run for president. He will win the Republican primary and be the nominee. And if Joe Biden, who I've known for years, I first met him and worked with him in 1980, what's that, 43 years ago, if his health remains viable, he will be the nominee for the Democrats. And so we'll see a replay of the last election with, I believe, the same result. If Biden remains healthy, I think he will defeat Donald Trump in the next election. Trump has gained support among his base and constituency as a result of these indictments, but not among the general population. And remember, he lost the last election by several million votes, and there's no reason to think he'll do better this time.
Okay, so this does hit on one of the concerning aspects of all of this, is that you've got a situation not where we're dealing with somebody who's a former president under these sorts of charges who is very unpopular, but we do have a president that is relatively still popular, and you know, the election, I guess it wasn't close, but it was almost, 45 to 50%, I guess, of the population supported and voted for the man that voted. Does this not, I mean, this is concerning, right? I mean, we're in a situation where we've got, it's almost like a developing nation's sort of political environment. Do you worry about where this could lead and how it could create further division within the country?
Yes, and that's why if I were a prosecutor, and, I know Merrick Garland, he was a student at Harvard, he was a judge, he's a very able man, he's the Attorney General of the United States. I think he made a mistake of prosecuting Donald Trump. I argued in my book, Get Trump, that in order to prosecute, forget about a former president, a man running for president against the incumbent president of your party, if you're the Attorney General, in order to prosecute that kind of case, it has to meet what I call the Richard Nixon standard and the Hillary Clinton standard. Now, what's the Richard Nixon standard? He was so obviously guilty of destroying evidence and bribing witnesses that even his own party, the Republicans, turned against him. He would have been impeached, perhaps unanimously, by the Senate and the House of Representatives both, had he not resigned. That was such an overwhelming case. That Nixon standard hasn't been met. The next standard is the Clinton standard. She, too, took material home with her. She had a home server, and she did destroy some emails. She claimed they were private emails, and I believe her. I know Hillary Clinton. I've known her for years. I like her. I voted for her. I contributed to her campaign. I campaigned for her. I like her. I wish she had won the election. And I don't think she was guilty of any crime. But I do think that in order for Trump to be prosecuted legitimately, it has to be a more serious case than the one against Hillary Clinton, the one against Joe Biden, the one against Vice President Pence. And it's not clear to me that this case, which is really a paper case, possession of classified material, and a process case, dealing with his lawyers in a way that is the prosecution thinks was unfair. I don't think that rises to the level of the kind of prosecution you bring that interferes with an election. And that's what this does. It becomes the central point in an election. We have more important things to think about: relationships with China, the economy, high technology, so many things, the environment. And yet the issue in the next election will be who's more guilty, the Biden family or Trump? And now we have all this evidence against the Biden family. I hope it's not true. And I clearly operate under my own presumption of innocence, and I won't conclude that he's guilty unless I see overwhelming evidence. But there are allegedly tape recordings, and there's a laptop, and there's other evidence. So I think what we're going to see is a campaign in which the Democrats are going to say Trump's a crook, and the Republicans are going to say that Biden's a crook, and that is going to resonate with a lot of voters, unfortunately.
Yeah. What is the distinction between the Hillary Clinton situation with the emails and the accusations against Trump now? Don't they both involve the private use of public materials or the private possession of public materials? Is that it? It's the Espionage Act?
Yeah, but I think the difference is in attitudes. Hillary Clinton mostly cooperated. She did destroy emails, but she claims that they were private and personal. Of course, we'll never know that because they were destroyed. The head of the FBI made a statement on the eve of the election saying that what she did was wrong, but nobody's ever been prosecuted for that. That statement is now being used to say, well, if nobody was prosecuted for that, why should they be prosecuted for what Trump did? Now, Trump, on the other hand, refused to cooperate, and he fought back, and he didn't give the classified material back, which if he had done that, probably he wouldn't have gotten indicted. But whether that rises to the level of an obstruction of justice, remember, under our system of justice, you don't have to cooperate with the prosecution or with the police, right, as long as you don't do anything illegal, right, and as long as you don't obstruct justice. So these are matters of degree, and I don't think matters of degree should be enough to interfere with an election, which is, after all, the most important thing that can happen in a democracy, is the election of president. And I just don't think that having a trial in the middle of a campaign is good for democracy and good for the American people. That's why I wrote my book, Trump.
You've seen a few elections, sir. Do you feel that this is a turning point, that we're at a point, like once upon a time, people would have just said, look, this is an inappropriate matter to pursue. It's basically fundamentally a case of legal technicality rather than any malicious intent.
Yes.
And we shouldn't pursue this because it's not the right thing to do. We can prosecute, but we shouldn't.
I think that's exactly right. I started voting in 1960 for John F. Kennedy. There were all kind of allegations that the West Virginia primary had been rigged, that there were other election irregularities. Lyndon Johnson was accused of, with his wife, improperly owning radio and television stations and using his influence to get those radio and television stations. Richard Nixon, of course, we know about, and other presidents too. I've had allegations against them. Bill Clinton, obviously, I was one of the lawyers defending Bill Clinton against his impeachment. You know, most of the people I've defended in my lifetime have been Democrats. I defended Senator Cranston from California, Ted Kennedy, I defended during the Chappaquiddick, and I defended Richard Nixon. And nobody criticized me for that. But as soon as I defended Donald Trump, I lost my friends. I lost my ability to speak in the library. I was canceled by other institutions and universities, etc. So we do have a double standard in the court of public opinion. The question is, do we also have a double standard of justice? And I think we do. And it's not liberal versus conservative or Democrat versus Republican. It's Trump versus the world. I think that people are so convinced that Trump is the most evil person ever to run for president that they will do anything to stop him from regaining the presidency. When I had my encounter with Larry David and he yelled at me and screamed at me, it was as if he was talking to Heinrich Himmler or Goebbels. It was as if the man I defended was Adolf Hitler. You can't imagine how emotionally upset he was. The veins on his forehead looked like they were going to burst. And it was genuine. He genuinely believes that the election of Donald Trump would be the end of America. And therefore, he's prepared to do anything to stop that from happening. And that's why the distortion of our legal system has occurred by good people, by liberal people, by people who generally defend the Constitution. They're prepared to make an exception. You know, they think this is unique in American history. They forget we've had so many experiences in American history, one that you know about in Australia, of course, is at the beginning of the Second World War, after the Japanese Air Force bombed Pearl Harbor, the United States of America, President Roosevelt, a great liberal president, put over 100,000 Americans of Japanese origin, of descent, into detention camps, completely in violation of the Constitution. And they justified it by saying, this is different. This is different. McCarthyism, they justified by saying, this is different. When Abraham Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus during the Civil War, he said, this is different. When we reacted to 9/11, George Bush said, this is different, when he justified torture and other unconstitutional means. And now people are saying Trump is different. Well, the Constitution was designed to protect against all circumstances, and there are no different circumstances under the Constitution. It's broad enough and flexible enough to cover all activities, and yet these people, particularly on the left, are willing to destroy the Constitution in order to prevent Trump from being elected president. That's why the title, Get Trump. That's their goal, get Trump. No matter what the means are, the end is justifiable, so get Trump.
It doesn't seem to me to be a particularly good political strategy either, because every time they go after him, he seems to become a little bit more powerful or a little bit more sympathetic.
Let me tell you why it is a good political strategy for the Democrats. Here, because, I'm a Democrat, and a lot of my friends are active in the Democratic Party. Here's their thinking. It's good to go after Trump. That will increase the chances that he will get nominated. And if he's nominated, he will be beaten in the general election. On the other hand, if he's not nominated, and if somebody like Ron DeSantis gets nominated, a younger version of Trump in their mind, and a more vibrant and more affable person, he really has a chance of beating the elderly president of the United States. So a lot of Democrats think it's good strategy to temporarily increase Trump's support so he gets the nomination, and then attack him in the general election, and maybe independents and moderates will then turn against him. It's a subtle and interesting strategy, but it still makes no sense when it comes to destroying our Constitution. It puts politics before the rule of law.
So they actually want him to win the nomination,
right.
And they think that they can beat him.
Yeah.
Right. Let's turn to President Biden and the charges against his son. These were fairly minor charges. Donald Trump and other analysts believe that this was some sort of PR stunt, in a sense. What's your take on the Hunter Biden situation?
Well, it's complicated, as so many things are. I think the deal that he made about the 3 charges that are involved, 2 charges of filing his taxes late and 1 charge about not filling in a form about guns that included his use of drugs. I think the sentence and the plea bargain for those 3 charges are perfectly fair. They don't suggest a double standard of justice. What might suggest a double standard of justice is why they haven't done more investigation of his laptop, of his relationship with Burisma, of those 17 tape recordings that are supposed to exist, 15 with Hunter Biden and 2 with President Joe Biden. And if there's anything to that, and he hasn't been prosecuted for that, and there's now a new allegation, it just came out literally today, that when the special prosecutor, the district attorney, said he wanted to expand the investigation beyond the state of Delaware, and he wanted to expand it to California and to the District of Columbia, the claim is, and I don't know whether it's true, but the claim is that the Justice Department refused to give him permission to do that. And that, if true, sounds something like a cover-up. And so, yes, the plea bargain over those 3 offenses were fair and reflects equal justice. But if there are other more serious crimes that haven't been adequately investigated and prosecuted if warranted, then it would show a double standard of justice. And the former special prosecutor, a guy named John Durham, just issued a report and testified in front of Congress, I think it was just yesterday, that there was a double standard of justice, that the investigative criteria were much, much lower for going after Donald Trump than they were for going after Hillary Clinton, reflecting a double standard of justice. If that's true, that is also a serious condemnation of the American system of justice.
It's also not healthy and leaves the voter uninformed, doesn't it? As they were, I guess, before the 2020 presidential election, when there was a suppression of the New York Post's story about the laptop, right? So again, we have a situation where we don't know what happened with the gas company in Ukraine, Burisma, and why was Hunter Biden on that board, and why was he being paid $1 million a year? All of these things left unanswered, unclear. It's not a healthy state of affairs for a good election.
It's very unhealthy, especially because Americans with just cause do not trust the media. They don't think they're getting the straight poop from CNN and from MSNBC or from Fox. They think they're getting narratives that reflect the biases, the political and partisan biases of the media. So they want to see and hear the evidence with their own eyes and ears. And that's why, for example, the trial of Donald Trump must be televised. Right now, it's not going to be televised. So we're going to have to depend on reporting and reading about the trial through the prism of biased media. It'd be so much healthier if every American could tune in and watch or listen to every minute of the trial and make their own evaluations of the strengths and weaknesses of the evidence. I'll give you a perfect example. On the day that Donald Trump was arraigned, there was no television coverage of his arraignment.
Yes.
And so left-wing media described him as slouching and defeated and looking very, very down. And the right-wing media described him as determined and his chest was out. It's the same person. But each side uses the description differently. And even the courtroom artist was criticized by the left for saying that they drew a picture of him in which he looked thinner and handsomer and younger than he actually looked. So even when you get the courtroom artist being accused of political bias, we know we have to have this trial on television so that every American and every Australian, everyone around the world can make a determination for themselves. And so I today made an offer. I offered the media, if they bring a lawsuit to try to get the trial televised, I will represent them pro bono, free of charge. I will help their legal team try to get this case put on television. Now, I have no idea whether Trump wants it on television or not. I have no idea whether the prosecutor wants it on television or not. But I know the American people want it on television, and I know it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, I think that level of transparency is absolutely necessary. We don't televise trials in Australia at all. I think there's very, very few exceptions where cameras have been allowed into the courtroom. And the argument is that you don't want to create a television circus or a media circus. But I think you get the media circus more when you don't have the openness and the transparency and the visibility.
I think that's right. And in America, we do televise trials, even sometimes federal ones. For example, when the Supreme Court had a very important argument as to whether to overrule a woman's right to choose abortion in Roe versus Wade, the Supreme Court made an exception and allowed the entire appeal to be transmitted by radio, not television, but transmitted live. And of course, in an appeal, you don't have to see the faces of the judges. It's good enough to hear their voices. But in a trial, it's important to see the faces of the witnesses. When they're asked hard questions, are they answering directly? It's important to see the face of the defendant. I'll tell you an interesting story. It's, I think, an apocryphal story, but it might as well be true. It's the story about the man who was accused of killing his wife, and there was no body, just circumstantial evidence. And the defense lawyer at the end of the case says to the jury, when I count to 10, look at the door, and this man's wife, who was supposed to be dead, will walk through the door. He counts to 10, nobody walks through the door. But he then turns to the jury and said, every one of you looked at the door, which means you must have had a reasonable doubt. But they convicted. And so he then went to the jurors and said, how could you convict? You all looked at the door. And the juror said, yeah, we looked at the door, but your client, the defendant, didn't look at the door. He knew that his wife was not walking through that door. True or not, it's so important to see the reaction of the defendant to the evidence, to see the reaction of witnesses to cross-examination questions. Why should we be denied that right? The Sixth Amendment to the Constitution calls for a public trial, and I define public as public as the technology permits. Back in the day when the Constitution was written, of course, there was no radio and television. But once radio and television came to be, public should include ability to see or hear on radio and television.
Yeah. Hunter Biden's situation, if it did blow up, if some of the claims that have been made or the scenarios that have been pieced together by some of the conservative media about what might have gone on in relation to Burisma, in relation to Hunter Biden and Joe Biden's involvement and relationship in China. How much of this is about protecting Joe Biden and how much is about protecting Barack Obama and the Obama brand from future damage?
We just don't know. Theory. We just don't know what the evidence is. And I don't want to speculate or engage in a presumption of guilty, but I can tell you this. If the allegations are in any way true, if in fact money was offered, and we don't know whether it was or not, these are very, very serious allegations. And transparency requires that we be able to listen to those 17 tapes. We be able to see what's on the laptop, of course, protecting national security and protecting legitimate rights of privacy. But in general, the presumption should be in favor of transparency, not in favor of secrecy, so that we can make our own judgment, both for purposes of elections and for purposes just of the court of public opinion. And I'm hoping that transparency will be effectuated by what's going on in Congress today. We have a system of checks and balances in the United States, and thankfully today, one house of Congress is controlled by the opposing party, and therefore they can have hearings, and that's a good thing. And they can call Hunter Biden, and if his case is over, he can't plead the Fifth Amendment. So it's a very strong possibility he may have to testify about his father, about Barack Obama. Nobody should be afraid of the truth, and nobody should try to protect anybody, whether Republican or Democrat.
Professor Dershowitz, the book in Get Trump, anything else that you've written about that we haven't addressed that you think people should know?
Well, I've written 52 books. I've just finished and sent to the publisher today my 53rd book. So if you want to come back for about a week, we can talk about all of my books.
I'd love to do that.
Which range over a wide variety of subjects. But right now, I think the focus is correctly on both Trump and Biden, and on the process. And, you know, process and procedures are very boring. People love results. But a great justice of the Supreme Court of the United States once said, the history of liberty is a history of procedure and process. If you don't have a good process, a good procedure, an honest procedure, which allows both sides to bring out the facts, you really can't have liberty. And I think that's what's being compromised today. That's why the First Amendment is so important, why due process is so important. And I'm going to continue to fight for those rights, whether it helps the Democrats or helps the Republicans, whether it makes me popular or unpopular. I think it's so important to have somebody being on the front line, standing up for these basic liberties in a nonpartisan way. And I see that as my role.
I'd like to just finish with one final question. If you could say anything to a young aspiring law student or any young Australian at the moment about the state of the world and the state of where our legal systems seem to be in relation to this politicisation, or give them some advice, what would be the top thing?
The first thing I would say is how odd it is. Usually when you get extremism, it's because there are extreme situations, a depression, physical problems with the world. But the world is in fairly decent shape. I mean, we have criticisms, but, you know, Australia, the United States, Canada, England, things aren't terrible. We're not at war. We're not in deep, deep depressions or famines or anything like that. So there's no excuse for what's going on. And what I urge is, yes, go to law school, Fight back against your professors and your administrators. Fight for what's right and always live a life of principle and develop a thick skin, because you will be criticized for it. But you will go to sleep at night with your conscience clear, knowing that you've helped to defend the most important and hard-earned freedoms that our countries collectively have. And that's our most valuable possession. And we share it with Australia, with Canada, with Great Britain, with the United States, with Israel, with today, with Germany, and with other countries. We share a deep commitment to civil liberties and human rights. Let's not lose it. Let's not let Donald Trump take it away from us.
Professor Alan Dershowitz, thank you very, very much for joining us on The Other Side Interviews. Great to talk to you.
Thank you for a great interview. Your questions were terrific. I appreciate it.
And that's it for The Other Side Interviews this week. And remember, The Other Side Australia, our weekly news and commentary summary show that gets you up to speed on all of the news of the week for the weekend, coming on Friday night at 8 p.m. here on ADH TV. It streams first and, of course, on demand for you all weekend and all weekend forever afterwards, as all our shows are. You can watch any of our interviews, our past interviews, and any of our episodes of The Other Side Australia right here on ADH TV. Now, how do you access ADH TV? Well, adh.tv on any web browser will take you straight to it, and you can select our shows. Otherwise, you can download the app. This is the best way to do it. Download the app on your phone or on your smart device or on your smart TV. All the really smart TVs you can download ADH TV app on. So do that, and then you'll have a Netflix stand type interface that you can have a look at all of our shows. Alan Jones and Daisy Cousins and Fred Paul and Mark Stein, of course, and all of the other wonderful Spectator shows as well with Alexandra Marshall. So do join us, do get involved, do support ADH TV, and please do tell your friends. As we always say, don't just like it, share it. The independent media, we really do need your support and your help. It's been great being with you this week. Look forward to seeing you on Friday night and again next Tuesday for The Other Side Interviews again. Take care. Have a good week.